The History of Port Huron and Detroit Railroad, Take 1. So how did the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad start out?
Well, the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad itself was formed in 1922 as a result of a series of very unfortunate incidences. Before it was the Port Huron and Detroit, it was the Port Huron and Southern Railroad running only between Port Huron and Marysville. It was bought by the Handy Brothers of Bay City, Michigan. The Handy Brothers owned a rail line known as the Detroit, Bay City, and Western between Bay City and Port Huron, Michigan, which was completed in 1918. The railroad, through the Handy Brothers, was intended to be part of an entire railroad system running from Detroit to Mackinac City. It was supposed to involve the two railroads previously mentioned and the Detroit and Mackinac, formerly the Detroit, Bay City, and Alpena. The railroad was supposed to be getting backing from the president of the Grand Trunk Railway. Unfortunately, the president of the Grand Trunk Railway died when the Titanic sank. As a result, when the Handy Brothers went to the Grand Trunk Railway to talk about getting funding to complete their railroad from Detroit to Mackinac, the new owners of the railroad said, "We don't know you. Why would we want to support you?" This resulted in the Handy Brothers lines going into bankruptcy. The Detroit, Bay City, and Alpena became the Detroit and Mackinac and ran only between Bay City and Sheboygan, Michigan. The Detroit, Bay City, and Western went into receivership and was later turned into the Detroit, Carey, and Sandusky, having their lines cut back from each end, both Port Huron and Bay City respectively, until it was running between the cities of Cairo and Sandusky, when it was finally abandoned in 1953 as an all-steam railroad. The Port Huron Southern was purchased by the Duffy family of Port Huron and was formed as the Port Huron and Detroit, and operated between 1922 and 1984.
How was the railroad bought by Chassis System, then CSX?
Well, in 1984, the Duffy family started going into financial problems. The railroad had been starting to lose customers at that time and were about to lose all of their business in the city of Marine City, which was their southern terminus. They had lost their connections with the Mackinac Transit Railway in the 50s and were steadily losing more and more customers. At a point, there had actually been over 100 customers on the entire line over the railroad's existence, although some of them were fairly sporadic. When the Duffy family was trying to look for potential buyers, they basically had three options: sell the railroad to someone else, sell the railroad to the Grand Trunk Western, or sell the railroad to the Chesapeake and Ohio, which in 1984 was part of the Chessie system. They weren't able to find anyone to buy out the railroad individually, and they didn't really have a direct connection with the Grand Trunk Western. Also, at the time, the Grand Trunk Western was more interested in trying to purchase the bankrupt Milwaukee Road. Chesapeake and Ohio was their only direct connection. The Y in Port Huron, where they had their yard offices, headquarters, roundhouse, everything, connected right up and was directly parallel to Chesapeake and Ohio's line into Port Huron that eventually went down to the water and their boat yard, where they had a ferry dock to ship freight cars over to Sarnia, Ontario to work on their former Père Marquette lines in Sarnia. As a result, the Duffy family chose the Chesapeake and Ohio to sell the railroad to. A few years later, I believe the year was 1987, the Chesapeake and Ohio's parent company, Chessie System, merged with the Seaboard System Railway, which is a combination of the Seaboard Coastline, Louisville and Nashville, Clinchfield, and a few other southern railways, to create CSX, hence the initials. C for Chessie, S for Seaboard, and the X standing for the multiplication of two very large railroad companies.
Why was the former Port Huron and Detroit Railroad built into a branch line?
Well, the Port Huron to Detroit was never intended to be a branch line railroad. As I had mentioned before, the Port Huron and Detroit was supposed to extend all the way to Detroit, hence its name. Its intentions were to buy out an interurban line that went from Marine City south through Algonac and Mount Clemens and straight down to Detroit. However, because that plan failed, the railroad terminated in Marine City. And when it terminated there, which was in the 1930s and 40s, there was no real railroad building in America anymore. By that time, railroads were actually starting to abandon older railroad lines due to the Depression and eventually World War II, when scrap drives were very high and the need for steel and other raw materials was very important. It had always been a branch line railroad, and when it was bought out by Chessie System, it stayed that way, operating as pretty much just to serve the industries that it had to get to that made the most money, and then they just cut the railroad off right there. Right now, its southernmost point isn't even Marine City anymore. It's now East China Township, which is where the power plants, the DTE power plants, are. Unfortunately, due to the recent fire at the St. Clair power plant and the plan for DTE to shut down all coal-fired power plants between 2020 and 2025, or 2023, depending on who you talk to, the main line may actually be cut back even further to St. Clair itself.
Were there more trains back then than there are now?
Well, actually, yes. There were a bit more trains. As I said, they had a lot more customers back then, and their main line went further. If I remember correctly, there were actually 2 trains every day that went out from and back from and to Port Huron, serving the various customers. They actually had a few, what some people would call spur lines. I would actually call them branch lines. One went directly into St. Clair itself, serving the Imperial Salt Company, and you also had a industrial spur or branch going on the south side of Port Huron. That was known as the South Park Spur, and that line itself had about, I'd say 10 customers at its peak. As business started to dry up, however, those trains started cutting back to 1 a day. However, nowadays, with the petroleum traffic, plastic traffic, and salt traffic, along with the coal traffic that you get still for the power plants, on a good day, you could actually see 3 trains a day on that line going out and back from Port Huron, if you're lucky.
Why does the former Port Huron and Detroit Railroad still use a chassis system caboose for their line?
Well, the line into St. Clair runs on what is known as a switchback. All the trains that run to it run facing south. The switch basically faces north. You have the single switch on the south side and the two north branches on the north side. The salt plant in St. Clair is facing with the two branches of the switch facing south and the single branch on the north. In order to get to and from, the trains have to go through a series of what are known as switchbacks. The train will run to one portion, stop at a dead end, then will back up the next line, stop, and then back in again. It was very common on logging railroads to get up very steep inclines, but on occasion, especially in industrial areas such as St. Clair, Michigan, they were also used to serve industries. Because of this, and also because of the light rail that is used on the Port Huron line, the CSX Railroad, and formerly the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad, used these cabooses as what were known as shoving platforms. The crews will stand on the caboose and have the locomotives on the opposite end. They will run the remote control locomotives up to the switch, get out of the locomotive, walk to the end of the train, switch the track, hop back on the caboose, and shove the train down the main track. Although most people used cabooses for long-distance trains for the conductors and on some occasions spare crew members to be housed, this one is simply used so that the crews can see where they are going. You can't really shove a really long freight train in reverse without someone being on the back end to keep an eye on things. And the reason it's painted in chassis system paint is simply because CSX has been lazy and hasn't really gotten around to repainting it yet. But then again, most of us rail fans aren't complaining. That to me is railroad heritage still living today.
I also heard that there are 2 special steam locomotives that were used for the Port Huron railroads and are now back in the Port Huron area.
Yes, there are. Alright, well, the 203 is also more involved in the history of the Port Huron and Detroit because it directly connected and worked with the Port Huron and Detroit, and was very identical itself to the steam locomotives that worked on the Port Huron and Detroit up until 1945. At its peak, the railroad was operating with a total of 12 small 060 steam locomotives. Some of them were even double-headed to pull the long freight trains out to Port Huron from Marine City, St. Clair, and Marysville, especially the extra long coal trains that worked in serving the Marysville power plant, or Big Mo. The 203 steam locomotives, along with its sister, the 202, which were both 060 steam locomotives, and the 202 now resides down in Grand Rapids, Ohio, on the former Toledo, Lake Erie, and Western. The 203, when it was shut down in the mid-1950s, was donated to the city of Marysville because the city of Marysville was basically founded around the power plant and the salt company, which were right next to each other. The 203 was run down from the old power plant, down the Port Huron and Detroit main line to where the park now is. They put in a dummy switch, temporary railroad switch, and laid some track into the park. They backed the steam locomotive onto it, dumped the fire, cut the track off, and left the locomotive sitting there as it was in the park as a memorial. The DB Harrington is the other steam locomotive in the Port Huron area. The DB Harrington was the first steam locomotive of the Port Huron and Northwestern, which was founded in 1878 as a logging railroad to serve the logging industry of the Thumb of Michigan. It was not necessarily the first railroad in Port Huron. That title goes to the Grand Trunk Railway predecessors, who finished their lines into Port Huron and Sarnia in 1859. However, when the huge forest fires of the late 1800s went through the Thumb of Michigan, all the logging industry disappeared. However, because that land was now cleared out, that line ended up moving to serve the farming industry. In fact, the Thumb of Michigan is now the largest producer of sugar beets in the world. But the DB Harrington holds a special place as it was the first locomotive of the first railroad company headquartered in the city of Port Huron and founded in Port Huron. The locomotive has run to various locations, not under steam, more on display, and for a time it was even down at the Cedar Point in Lake Erie, down at Cedar Point, Ohio. But because of some boiler issues, the locomotive has now been deemed unfit for service and will never run again, unfortunately. However, the locomotive is now owned by the Port Huron Museum and is intended to go through a cosmetic restoration to make it look like it once did when it first ran in Port Huron back in 1878, and will hopefully pave the way for a better understanding of the history of railroads in the Port Huron area.
What are some sites I should visit when I am in Port Huron?
Well, if you're going for the railroads, one place that you would definitely want to visit would be the Amtrak station on 16th Street. The station is a very unusual building, and it was built in the 1970s after the former tunnel depot on Railroad Street, just about a quarter mile to the west of the current location, was torn down. And of course, there's also Tappan and West Tappan, which are a few locations just to the west of Port Huron. Tappan being the west end of the tunnel yard in Port Huron, and West Tappan being the farthest junction outside of Port Huron, where the double track line goes down to the single track to continue on to the Flint subdivision to Flint, Lansing, and Battle Creek. And you also have the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad Historical Society on 32nd Street, which is now housed in the former headquarters of the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad. A couple times a year, they'll have Hobo Fest and National Train Day celebrated there. They will have model layouts, They occasionally have live steam events. They always have a cookout. They have movie showing of both historic and modern railroad movies. And most Saturdays they're open to volunteers who want to come and help work on restoring the building, the caboose, and the future number 52, which is an original Port Huron and Detroit locomotive that is being returned to the Port Huron area within the next year or so. If you're looking outside of just railroads, there's the Blue Water Boardwalk, which is also next to the former Thomas Edison Depot. The Thomas Edison Depot is named as such as it is just up the road from the childhood home of Thomas Edison, who actually got his first job as a 12-year-old boy on the predecessor for the Grand Trunk Railway. And it's also with the railroad that he started his work in telegraphy and various other things that eventually helped him become the famous inventor that we know today. Also there you of course have the Blue Water Bridge, which gets plenty of truck traffic and is always scenic to take pictures of. You have the railroad line, which is the old rail line between Port Huron and Detroit. And you also have the St. Clair River, which gets plenty of boat traffic. You have many Great Lakes freighters carrying ore and oil and coal and gravel, cement, and many other commodities throughout the Great Lakes, headed to places like Chicago, Green Bay, Saginaw, Duluth, Superior, Sault Ste. Marie, many famous places throughout the northern Great Lakes in Lake Huron, Superior, and Michigan. And you also have foreign vessels that go through the area, and they can carry many things, including windmill turbines and windmill parts. And of course, when you're talking about boats, you can't forget the lighthouse in Port Huron, which is always a scenic place to go visit and one of the tallest locations in the entire city of Port Huron, and was very involved in the ship history of Port Huron. And of course you also have the various museums in Port Huron. You have the downtown area, which has plenty of shopping and restaurants, and we're even working on a brand new movie theater. You have the beaches along the river and lake, which are great for swimming. You have the float down every year, which it actually recently made international news when U.S. partiers were accidentally blown across the river to Canada. You have the Port Huron to Mackinac yacht race, which is always big. You start off with a parade that goes straight through downtown Port Huron, and you have a fair, which is always fun. You have parties and live bands and a bunch of other fun things going up and down the river. You have the powerboat races that right in downtown, right on the water, in fact, and a bunch of other fun things to go on.
Thank you for telling us about the history of the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for telling us history about the Port Huron and Detroit Railroad.
Oh, you can do it again.
Let's do it.
1, 2, 3. Thank you very much for telling us about the history of the 1, 2, 3. Thank you very much for telling us the history of the former... 1, 2...
This is definitely going on the bloopers section.
This is definitely going on the bloopers. All right, 1, 2, 3.
Question, rail fans?